Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive, and this one's especially for you because you guys are the ones who sent us all this stuff about MQA,
Right.
this audio format that, well, it promised a revolution, but then kind of went belly up.
Yeah. Bankrupt.
So we're going to do our best to, unpack the tech, the hype, all the controversy, and see if we can figure out why MQA ultimately, it just kind of faded out, didn't it? We've got a super detailed technical review from way back in 2018, and then a more recent update from like late 2024 on what's happened since the company, since it went kaput.
Right.
So ready to dive in.
Yeah, let's do it. It's a fascinating story. And to really understand MQA's like rise and fall, you almost have to rewind back to like the mid 2010s, because back then digital audio was already like a pretty crowded space.
Oh, totally. I mean, people were already ripping their CD collections, building those digital libraries,
Yeah.
FLA, CWAV. All those options were already right there at their fingertips. So, what problem was MQA even trying to solve? It's not like there was this gap in the market.
Right. That's the million-dollar question, right? Were they like a solution in search of a problem? Because consumers back then, they were already pretty format agnostic, I think.
Yeah.
Like they cared more about convenience and quality than the specific format. You know what I mean?
Totally. So then MQA bursts onto the scene with these, pretty bold promises, right?
Yeah.
Studio sound,
Mm-hmm.
but in a smaller file size, lossless quality. And then there was all this talk about de-blurring, this magic they could do to the sound. Did anyone actually buy it? Was anyone really convinced?
Well, audiophiles, the people who like really obsess over every little sonic detail, they were intrigued for sure. And MQA's timing was also interesting because high resolution audio was it's starting to gain some real traction.
Right.
And their whole pitch was all about delivering that high-res experience, but more efficiently.
Well, but with a twist, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about compressing audio. They were claiming to actually improve it somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where some of the skepticism really started to set in, I think. That 2018 source you sent over, that really technical deep dive, they really dig into the nuts and bolts of all this.
Oh, yeah?
And it suggests that MQA wasn't truly, quote-unquote, lossless as they claimed, but actually partially lossy.
Okay, time for my favorite game, Jargon Buster. What does partially lossy even mean in, plain English?
Okay, so think of bit depth like the resolution of a digital image, right?
Mm-hmm.
More bits basically means more detail. So what MQA was doing was they were selectively tossing out some of those bits, mainly in the quiet parts of the music.
Interesting.
And they claimed it wouldn't even be noticeable, but that's where the controversy really started brewing.
So they were basically saying, trust us, your ears won't know the difference.
Essentially, yeah. And to make matters even more complicated, they used some really clever techniques to actually hide this lossiness.
Okay, so you've got this lossy versus lossless debate simmering in the background. But then on top of that, MQA was making a really big deal about temporal accuracy, this whole de-blurring thing. They even brought in, neuroscience to explain it all.
Yeah, it was a core part of their pitch for sure. They were claiming that traditional digital audio, even at high resolutions, had this inherent blurring, this temporal smearing, and MQA was supposed to fix it, resulting in, more natural, more realistic sound.
And they had those fancy diagrams too, right? Like that impulse response graph showing how their filter was cleaning up the audio signal.
Which is fascinating because according to that 2018 source, that's where MQA's claims really start to fall apart.
You're telling me those fancy diagrams were more smoke and mirrors than actual science? Well, for one thing, it showed that MQA's filter wasn't really doing what they claimed. In fact, it was actually kind of introducing its own distortions.
What?
Yeah, kind of like adding a little audio echo, muddying up the sound, even if it wasn't there originally.
Hold on, are you saying they were trying to sell us on de-blurring when their tech was actually adding blur?
Yeah, pretty much. And there's more. Remember how MQA claimed to improve temporal accuracy? Well, it turns out their filter actually introduced this thing called group delay, which basically means different frequencies in the music hit your ears at slightly different times than they should, even if they were perfectly aligned in the original recording. So much for that whole studio sound promise. It sounds like they were basically making the audio less accurate.
Yeah, it seems that way. And the thing is, these weren't just theoretical flaws, they were measurable, objective differences. There were tests done on a popular DAC at the time, and the results showed that MQA's filter actually performed worse than other options, leading to, more distortion.
Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say the elephant in the headphones. Even if, the measurements look bad on paper, maybe MQA still sounds better. Like maybe the average listener wouldn't even notice those technical flaws we've been talking about.
Right, the subjective versus objective experience. That's the million-dollar question. And it's tricky because MQA, they made all these bold claims about how amazing their format sounded, but they weren't exactly, lining up to do open A/B testing, especially not in the early days.
Sounds a little suspicious, doesn't it? Like you
It's
wanted people to just take their word for it.
Yeah, it does make you wonder. But as MQA started to gain traction, people did try to put their claims to the test. Like in 2017, there was this internet blind test. Basically, listeners had to try and identify which tracks were the MQA versions.
Drumroll, please. Did MQA pass with flying colors?
Not quite. The results were pretty clear, actually. Listeners just couldn't reliably tell the difference between MQA and non-MQA tracks. In fact, some even said they preferred the non-MQA versions.
So much for that night and day difference some reviewers are going on about.
Exactly, and it's like the cracks were starting to show elsewhere, too. Even some of MQA's early supporters, in the audiophile press,
Yeah.
they were even starting to express doubts.
Really?
Yeah, it was the Emperor's New Clothes. Once a few people started questioning the hype, the whole facade just kind of started to crumble.
Which leads us to another really fascinating aspect of this whole thing. MQA's so-called philosophy about audio.
Hmm.
Because it was about more than just a new format, right?
Yeah.
They were trying to rewrite the rules of how we perceive and measure audio quality.
Oh, absolutely. They argued that traditional metrics, things like bit depth and sample rate, those were outdated and didn't really tell the whole story. Instead, they wanted to focus on what they believed were the most important elements of studio sound and deliver that in a smaller package.
Which, now that you mention it, kind of sounds a lot like what MP3 was trying to do, right? Like using psychoacoustics to shrink files down without supposedly sacrificing quality.
You're spot on. It's really interesting how MQA, they seem to be following a similar playbook as MP3, but they were very reluctant to admit to any parallels, especially when it came to, the lossy nature of their compression. It was lossy was a dirty word to them.
But their whole philosophy, it went even further, right? They have this whole end-to-end analog solution idea, which honestly always felt a little vague to me.
Yeah, that was a big part of their pitch, though. This idea that, we shouldn't just focus on the digital parts of audio, but consider, the entire chain from the studio microphone all the way to your living room speakers. They were trying to position themselves as, more holistic, more in tune with the quote-unquote truth of audio.
But how could they possibly, account for every single variation in people's listening setups? Everyone has different speakers, different rooms, different preferences.
Yeah.
It's just not realistic, is it? It always felt like they were trying to deflect from the actual technical shortcomings of their format by throwing around these really grand, almost philosophical ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. And speaking of controlling the narrative, let's talk about DRM. That's a whole other chapter in the MQA saga.
Right. Digital rights management, always a hot topic. So what was MQA's stance on that? Did they want to keep things open and accessible, or were there strings attached?
Well, their relationship with DRM is complicated. On the surface, it wasn't as restrictive as some other schemes out there. You could copy MQA files. They didn't, phone home to some central server to make sure you were allowed to play them.
So not like those bad old days of DRM where you were basically just renting music, not actually owning it.
Exactly. But they still exerted control, just in a more subtle, more MQA way, for example, to decode and play back MQA files in their, full glory, you needed licensed software or hardware. And it had to be specifically authorized by them. It was this exclusive club, and you could only join if you played by their rules.
What were those rules exactly?
Well, MQA files, they contain this digital signature, a seal of approval. And if your playback system wasn't authorized, you might be able to play the file, but you wouldn't get the full MQA experience. It was their way of controlling how you listen to your music.
Okay, so maybe not quite as draconian as some other DRMs, but it still feels like they were kind of holding your music hostage, doesn't it?
You raise a valid point. There were definitely concerns about how MQA's approach could, limit consumer choice, push people towards specific hardware and software, all under the guise of this, higher audio quality.
There was that patent from 2014 where they were talking about things like actually limiting quality for unauthorized devices.
Precisely. And that context is important, I think. It adds another layer to this whole MQA story, raises questions about their motivations. Were they truly trying to improve the listening experience for everyone, or were they more interested in controlling it?
It's definitely something to think about, especially because, well, the MQA story doesn't end with their bankruptcy, does it? So let's fast forward to today, late 2024. and see what became of MQA after the dust settled. Like, pieces of it are still floating around out there, right? It's a ghost in the machine of digital audio.
Yeah, for sure. Their assets were picked up by Lenbrook, the company behind NAD, Blue Sound, PSB,
Right.
and they seem to be more interested in maybe salvaging parts of the technology than actually trying to like resurrect the whole MQA thing.
Right. So instead of like hitting play on MQA, they hit shuffle and see what comes up.
Exactly. They started talking about things like AIRA, which is a data rate adaptive codec.
Okay.
It sounded like it could be useful for streaming, you know? Imagine audio quality that adjusts on the fly depending on your internet connection.
Right. Kind of like how video streaming will adjust the quality so you don't get that annoying buffering.
No, like, groundbreaking products or anything. No sign of that MQA streaming service they kept hinting at. It makes you wonder if Lenbrook is maybe rethinking that whole purchase.
Yeah. It begs the question, could they have avoided all this if they just played their cards differently? Like, what if they had been more upfront about their tech, embraced like those open standards, maybe even collaborated with some of their competitors instead of trying to control like everything?
Right, it's a fascinating thought experiment. Maybe they could have been the next MP3, right? Widely adopted, accepted as like the standard. Or maybe they were, maybe their fate was sealed from the beginning by that business model, this insistence on control rather than openness.
It's like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water.
But you can't make it embrace loss and compression disguised as something better.
Exactly. But joking aside, it seems like the world of digital audio has kind of moved on. Open formats are thriving. Lossless is becoming the standard. Streaming services are constantly evolving.
Yeah.
MQA, for all its like grand promises and controversial tech, kind of ended up as just a footnote in that evolution.
A footnote that I think teaches us a lot about like the intersection of technology and marketing and consumer trust,
For sure. And, somewhere out there's probably someone still rocking out to their MQA collection, blue light glowing. But for the rest of us, it's a good reminder to like stay curious, keep asking questions, and don't always believe the hype.
Here, here.
Even, and maybe especially, when it comes from those audiophile magazines. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wild world of MQA. We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, keep exploring, keep listening, and as always, thanks for diving deep with us.